Take your seats. We're going to get started. I'm Allison Weisbrot. I'm the editor of Campaign US. And we are going to talk about AI, data, and measurement, enabling large-scale personalization. So I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll kick it off. Stevie, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Stevie Archer. I'm the Executive Creative Director at SS&K, which is part of MNC Saatchi Group, and happy to be here today.
Hi everyone, I'm James Slezak. I'm CEO and co-founder of Swayable.
Good morning everyone, I'm Louisa Wong and I'm the CEO for Extreme Reach.
Awesome. So we talk a lot about personalization at scale in this industry. It's one of those buzzwords we like to throw around, but what does that actually mean in practice? Who wants to kick it off? Louisa.
What does personalization mean in practice? I think getting rid of redundancy and being able to speak to the consumer to drive motivation or action. And when I think of personalization, I think where I'd see it best today is probably in my Netflix account. Based on my browsing, my consumption behaviors. Okay, sometimes my daughter gets hold of the remote control, but broadly speaking, it's kind of got the content right. So when I think about personalization, the fact that I would spend 45 minutes browsing Netflix before I finally find a piece of content I like, kind of suggests that it works, but it also doesn't, because it has to drive intent, has to drive that engagement. And I think, well, I won't answer the second part of the question, but when I think of personalization today, I think it's all over the place, quite frankly, because we've been so obsessed with PII, we've been so obsessed with understanding consumers' motivation intent, we've lost sight of where creativity starts to play a role when we think about personalization.
James, yeah, talk a little bit about, we were just chatting before the panel about how personalization has been a very bottom funnel optimization type of process. So talk a little bit about how it's moving up the funnel.
Yeah, I think one of the most important trends here is that people do think of personalization as like everybody gets their own thing, you personalized gift. But of course in the marketing industry, that's not what it means. You have to tell stories. You're not going to make one for every person. So the relevant question is what kinds of groupings of folks, what segmentations are relevant, and what stories are going to move them the most to achieve the business goal, which is usually a persuasion goal. I want to make you like this brand or this idea or this product. So I think that trend towards people realizing that personalization doesn't happen at the level of each of the billions of people around the world, but that it's about more intelligent forms of segmentation. That to your point, that the PII is actually not necessarily sort of creepy stealing everybody's personal data approach that we began to hear about 10 years ago is actually not necessary for doing really smart personalization of creative.
Well, and from a creative perspective, the challenge has always been the at-scale part, because the more things that you have to make for more very different people, it creates a lot of assets to output. Things have to be optimized for different audiences, for the personal reasons why we're targeting them. That means making a lot of things, and up until now, a lot of times that means you're shaving edges, you're personalizing but not getting richer, interesting experiences. You're sort of getting the part of an experience that is the version that you're able to achieve at that kind of volume. So I think the promise of where things are going is if you can generate content and assets in a much more efficient way, does that allow us to make personalized experiences feel a little bit better than the version of personalized we've been getting? And that's kind of a very interesting and optimistic thing to think about.
Yeah, I'm curious, Stevie, from your creative perspective, now that we have tools like AI and sort of, what Swayable and Extreme Reach do in terms of getting data on the actual creative assets even before sometimes they hit the market, how has your perspective on personalization and, targeting and optimization changed in recent years? Because it used to be so, media, the media side of the business would talk about it and the creatives wouldn't. But now it's sort of, I see it melding together. I'm curious if you feel the same.
Well, I'm the kind of creative that doesn't understand why nobody wants to talk to the creatives about the creative.
That's fair.
I like to get my hands into media. I like to understand strategy. If you don't understand where it's going and who you're talking to and why you're trying to say those things, then it absolutely is going to result in a less good product or a less good message for the consumer. So I do think that having the conversation about understanding why things need to be personalized before you ever make them is a really important one to be having. And I do think there's times, and I've worked with clients in the past, just because you can doesn't mean you should. At a certain point, a level of personalization gets so far down to the specifics that you sort of run out of runway in order to do those things. And those are the kinds of conversations you have to have before you go commit and make and run campaigns and do programs that are at scale like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a great point about personalization and optimization having been focused on the media planning for the longest time, because of course, data, numbers, who's clicking, who's liking, everybody can see that. But I think your point is a critical one. That at the end of the day, there are people talking to people here. There are creators with cool ideas, and they're trying to get them into the heads of consumers. And the rest of us, tech platforms and the distributors and the publishers are just a means to achieving that. And if it's not useful for the creatives, or it's not getting the right thing to the consumers, then it's sort of what are we doing here? And I think, so we sort of tapped out a lot of that optimization potential at the really micro level. I think, the new wave of, data, we believe strongly, is sort of helping people like Stevie to figure out if, she's achieving her goals, and ideally telling her tomorrow, not sort of 6 months later, so, she's on to, the next award that she's winning and doesn't need the results anymore.
I think another thing I'll add as well, when we think of consumer attention, right? Yes, there's the creative side of it, but I just think of the simple Super Bowl ad from, was it last year, the Coinbase ad that crashed the internet? That wasn't super creative, but it was super creative as well at the same time. Simplicity is also key. I think sometimes we tend to over-engineer when we think about what personalization means, and we kind of lose sight of what the brand messaging actually is supposed to land on. So remove the complexity, start thinking more simplicity around your audiences. What is going to drive that? To your point about storytelling, how do you actually drive that engagement? And also start to think about the different mediums in which you're engaging on. My behavior, as we all are, very different when I'm watching TV versus when I'm on my phone. And yet we still think that the creative experience should look the same across all, because I've spent so much money filming this piece of ad. So again, when we start thinking about personalization, adaptability to the platform is also really key when we start thinking about that at scale.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to your point about, the big production and 90-second video, that's sort of the crown jewel, right, of like what every creative wants to work on. How are you noticing a shift now that the media landscape is so different, of creatives like leaning into more of that lo-fi, like the Coinbase ad, or versioning for different platforms? I'm curious, Louisa, like since you get access to so much data on creative, what are you seeing in terms of shifting the way creative gets out into the market to personalize at scale?
Well, here's an interesting stat. I won't say who, but we have some clients that don't even use up to 70% of the assets they have in their creative asset management platform. Why? I don't know. Maybe they're being more efficient. Maybe they're being more effective in the use of versioning. But the reality of it is, great content and great creative is being developed out there. But maybe they're not armed with the data and the insights to be able to make better decisions. And to what Swayable does and what James does in his business is absolutely right, because every piece of content you create, you now need to understand the ROI related to it, not just saying, hey, I've created something really beautiful, here's where it's going to live, and let's just put it on the TV.
It's so interesting because you get the too many things being created problem, and then sometimes you also talk to people as well who sort of are still making like one ad, as you said, the hero piece of content, and haven't developed the processes yet to take advantage of the data and the flexibility of the AI platforms that are out there now. We work with a lot of management consultancies for this reason, because we realize we build tech, it can be used by creatives, but if the creatives are given a certain job in a certain process that someone else has designed, and they're given this brief and then they're required to do this thing by this day, if that's the problem, that process, there's actually change management work that has to happen to take advantage of the new tech.
Yeah, I would say a lot of that comes down to production reality and production planning, and how and when that fits into your process of planning a campaign development. I would say, in my experience, I've seen the evolution. Of course, I had the fortunate reality of entering advertising to make TV commercials the year that Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, so that changed entirely. So I've been adapting to the reality of how to create advertising that lives across platforms in many, many ways for a long time. And I've watched ads. It used to be make the TV spot and then just cut it into different shapes and sizes to fit on the other platforms. Now we're definitely at a point where clients themselves are saying, do not give me a TV, make me a TV spot, but don't give me just TV for social and digital platforms. These need to be platform native. So there's a realization that they have to, and clients have to invest in that as well, because it means more production dollars, it means more asset creation, it means more licensing, it means more everything, the more things that you make. And so it kind of is a push and pull from both sides of agency, creatives, media, brands, all having to kind of build those plans together and do it from the beginning in order to make that possible.
One of the things I think we need, that not enough focus maybe is being discussed is around creative optimization. That's still being left at the last mile. When media agencies, oh, well, if I create 1,000 versions of a dynamic creative ad, that's going to sell my product. And the reality of it is, we've all seen it, it doesn't work. They're the creepy ads that follow you around and say, you left this in your basket. So, when I think of ads like that, I think of the wastage that actually is going along with that. In actual fact, you're doing worse for the environment when we talk about being net zero. You're doing worse for the consumer experience because they're going, this is just creepy and it's following me around. So you don't build the brand love, you don't create the brand loyalty that really you deserve. So I think, again, creative optimization, I would love to be able to empower creatives with data to make better decisions, not just with versioning, but also to think about consumer intent, customer segmentation, how that starts to inform, but really starting to apply the science to the art.
I think my diagnosis of part of what's happened is we got these incredible tools, when you spoke about when Mark Zuckerberg launched this platform and Sergey Brin and Larry Page launched theirs, and they were kind of cool, and suddenly the ad industry was like, oh my god, all this data, we can optimize all this stuff. But after about 10 years of doing that, a lot of people sort of forgot to ask, what is the point of this campaign? And they got kind of seduced by the data. And we call this the streetlight fallacy, which is sort of, you look for your keys where you drop them, not where the light's better, if you've lost your keys. And the marketing industry sort of forgot after 10 years that, the bottom of the funnel red-blue optimization of the click-through rates wasn't why people were telling these stories. They wanted more brand love, or they wanted more demand. Maybe that shows up in a shop, a month later. It doesn't necessarily happen in that ad unit. So where are the metrics for that? And instead of going and finding them, with a little bit harder, it's a little darker, it might take a bit more effort, they started just looking where the light was better, and the click-through rates were easier to get, so you got all this micro optimization that wasn't telling the big stories properly.
Well, it seems like there's still barriers, right, of talking about optimization and measurement in terms of creative. Like, I feel like that conversation becomes very like, oh, DCO, and that's also bottom of the funnel. In what ways, Louisa and James, are you kind of pushing the conversation when you talk to creatives and sort of explaining that it's not just about that swapping the color of the background and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I find most exciting about the shift in the use of data is actually getting the creatives excited. Like, this is an opportunity to take more risks. Remember that moment you're in the briefing room, you had this killer idea, but it was a little too risky, and either the client or whoever else kind of just sort of shot it down, and you just felt like maybe it would have worked. Taking that moment and arming them with a way to get an answer that, tomorrow you can determine maybe it didn't work, you're right, or actually, hold on a second, we've got something here, let's take it forward. So I think, for me personally, that's an exciting shift in the dynamic, yeah.
I like to shift the conversation away from just media ROI to creative ROI. And I think when you start to look at life cycles, when you start to look at versioning, where AI comes into play, I think with generative AI, we can start to see in real time what, not necessarily personalization, but what messaging and what storytelling is actually landing. And I think building that connectivity, empowering brands with that information, and with creative agencies and media agencies, if you can start to act on creative ROI in a meaningful way, you can actually tell better stories and actually reduce wastage in your ecosystem.
Let's talk about AI, big topic at the festival and the world. So talk about how AI sort of like supercharges this process. I feel like because creatives, it's so tangible, right? ChatGPT and these generative AI tools, they can play with them and they can see how data and technology can influence not just, the end product, but the actual idea and concept building and all of that. How is that pushing the conversation forward in terms of creative ROI and creative optimization?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're tremendously excited about AI. We started a company in 2018, which was a far distant time for those who still remember before ChatGPT was launched, back in the distant past. And we laid out this vision for why this would be a big deal, in many decades to come. And we said, step one, measure stuff properly because you got to get that right, otherwise you don't know what's going on. Step two, sort of scale it up. And then step three, one day AI may be able to generate creative content, and this data will help us figure out which of it is going to work. And we were going through this program called Y Combinator at the time, full of crazy, dreaming, big, crazy ideas. And even in that community, people looked at that and they're like, yeah, maybe 30 years, maybe 40 years. Nobody there thought that, 2023, we'd be sitting around having a conversation with people actually, the bags that Constanza from Swable made here were, made on Midjourney, the images on the front of them. That wouldn't have been imaginable. So I think, yeah, you've got an opportunity to ideally speed up and support the work of cool creatives, I think, as opposed to replace it. give them a superpower, the way that a typewriter and got replaced by copy and paste on a word processor. That's my hope.
What's a typewriter?
Well, I used to work at the New York Times, and they had like a whole desk of people that would copy and paste the actual things, like with scissors. They had pneumatic tubes. That was like half the newsroom in the 70s.
Journalism.
I think I've seen AI really mainly, well, not mainly, but used for operational efficiencies, quite frankly. I think that's been around for like 3-4 years, where I see people trying to use that, either aiding with media planning, whether it's with data analytics, whether it's looking at measurement. But when I start thinking about AI and creativity, I feel that people are still testing and learning into it. Because, in fact, James and I were just talking about this. We've encouraged a whole generation of kids to go through STEM, but actually the new thing now is AI, because AI is going to replace potentially data scientists and data engineers of the future. So when I think about AI, I think we're all easing into it. You've seen various tests where they've tried to put AI against creative, and that guy who won the music festival recently, and he finally admitted that it was an AI-generated piece of music. Those lines are blurred, and I think if we're not careful, it could mean, I'm not saying it will replace roles, I can't imagine that, because you still need the human touch. So I think there's a heap of opportunity with AI, but I think organizations are approaching it very carefully, because they're really trying to figure out, how does it live in our ecosystem? How does that replace, I don't want to say people, but replace roles and start to evolve responsibilities of the creative agency, the media agency, and technology infrastructure that powers the ecosystem?
Stevie, I'm curious your perspective from the creative side.
Well, it's interesting because I think, Louisa, you touched on the fact that, yes, there's generative AI that creates actual visual output, creates words and text output. But there's also AI that is helping do the type of analytics and data gathering, and in typical fashion in advertising, the thing that's getting the most attention right now is the stuff people can see. And that's probably the place where it's, in some cases, the least developed and will be difficult to see, like, how does it actually affect creative output? Does it really work? Does it make everything look a little weird? I will say from my perspective, I can't keep my own creative department from not wanting to get their hands all over it, because it's about reducing effort in places that have taken a lot of time, particularly in things as we've gotten away from the typewriters and the spray mount rooms and the cutting out and the drawing of illustrations. Clients have gotten more and more used to seeing spec ideas that look nearly finished, and we've been doing that with Photoshop and Creative Suite by hand with, for hours and hours and hours. We can do those things now to even show what an idea could be in much shorter amounts of time. So then we're able to spend more time creating and less time navigating. So I think that is where we're sort of seeing the promise of it. I think where it starts to get really challenging is, should any of that stuff start to get out into the world, you run into legal challenges and, where did it come from? What is it? So for those reasons, it's easier to see how AI being used for things like data gathering and analysis and all of the stuff that will not have as many of those outward issues that creative work can have, will be the thing that really starts to drive and push faster, because it will be easier to adopt while we're figuring out whether or not we're allowed to make music with a computer or not.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of efficiencies to be gained, and a lot of, it speeds up a lot of manual processes that were in the past you had to do by hand. But I'm curious, specifically, how is AI going to impact the whole personalization at scale conversation? Is it going to make it easier to personalize? Is it, like you said, Stevie, going to have some legal challenges along with it? Like, what are some of the benefits and also some of the risks?
I was going to say the way we've been using it the most at Swayable is actually by using it to get more out of consumers. So we're supporting the personalization and development of different creative assets by understanding how they move different consumers and even what those consumers say. Often though, the consumers don't want to sit there and tell us a lot of stuff because they just don't feel like it. They're talking to some web form that we put together, and it's a nice web form, but ultimately they know there's not a real intelligence on the other side of it. And we're experimenting now with that computer they're talking to, interviewing them, asking them for more questions, asking them for more answers, giving them more questions. And we've been blown away by the extent to which just doing that gets more insight out of the consumers, because suddenly they say, oh, I didn't really like that ad, it was, it's boring. And then but the computer's like, oh, you said it's boring? What was boring about it? And suddenly they're like giving us a whole bunch of extra insight that goes straight back to the creative room. So I think that's kind of an exciting example of where, to your point, it's not replacing people, it's not really replacing roles, but it's adding insight. So hopefully we can do more of that.
I think we were debating about it earlier, just again going back to the measurement piece where AI starts to play a role. A lot of people are talking about predictive modeling or propensity modeling, and I think this is where AI can come in and start to stress test a lot of these hypotheses that have been built. And I think if you can get that real-time feedback in a meaningful way, going back to the point about bringing the science to art, actually empowering creatives, not just the media agency, with what all that data actually means. So I think that being able to get to faster decisions and then being able to react to it or to implement change, that's where I see a real opportunity to surface those insights in a manageable way that allows people to take action. Because right now it's all observations and insights, but nothing that is actionable today. And I'd love to see more action being taken around whether it's analytics or whether it's around just how consumers are engaging with a piece of content. Think of like Black Mirror on Netflix. I'm not a Netflix fan, but clearly I'm quoting them this morning. But Black Mirror, the interaction that you have with the screen, all of that data sits within the wall garden. Now you've got AI that can start to build propensity models based on some of the masked, hidden data that you get back from Netflix in a meaningful way. You can now start to take action. You can start to break down those silos that exist across all the media wall gardens that live around today. And retail media networks, a new wave of wall gardens. Again, I think that's another opportunity to take large data sets and start to make sense of how you correlate that back with the creative process.
Yeah, I mean, Extreme Reach has so much creative data, right, about the assets and who's seeing them and where they're running and all of that. Like, do you see the measurement piece, right, becoming more actionable because of AI, and how does that? Because measurement is another conversation that felt very media, right? Like, we have to measure the ROI, who saw it, all of that. How is the conversation about measurement and analytics changing now that we have AI and we have all of this creative data at our fingertips?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly the right question to ask, and I think your point is spot on. People did think that they would just measure the easier stuff, and then when they didn't have data on the harder stuff, they would just point to the easier measurement and kind of go, well, there's some data over there, let's just use that. So we really do see that shifting. I mean, we don't want to flatter ourselves, but we think we're part of a conversation that's evolving about more intentional ways to understand the role of data in these kinds of processes. So I do see that shifting. That used to be a more uphill argument for us, and I think there's now a lot more pull for it. And I think the AI contribution to that I think is potentially enormous. There's probably buckets of areas. I'm an ex-management consultant myself, so there'll be some structure here, some framework will break it down. But one of them is clearly speeding up the analysis, doing a bunch of work that was manual, not being manual anymore. I think a second one is to your point, versioning, different kinds of versions, different person in the ad, different talk track, different soundtrack, even if maybe you recorded it one way. All of that, you can imagine testing new things in ways that are much more efficient. It's always tragic when someone's like, oh, I wish we tried it this other way, but I haven't got time to reshoot it. Well, being able to just sort of say, hey, reshoot with this script instead of that script would be a fantastic way to test the alternatives. And I think the third way that we're already doing is getting more from each consumer. They're giving us a few minutes of their time. Don't ask them some pre-baked set of questions. Dig in where they've told you something interesting and back off in other areas they haven't got as much to say. So all of that helps measurement. It means what the ROI is going to come from.
Yeah, Stevie, is SS&K incorporating measurement in different ways in terms of looking at how creative performed, whether or not that involves AI?
We adapt measurement to different campaigns and different types of clients depending on what it is that they need. So most of the time, though, in fact, working with Swayable, we've done some survey data and things like that before. We've done campaigns that help inform work that we need to do. And most of the work that we're doing in terms of measurement is happening post-campaign launch and determining performance and whether or not it's, achieving its goals, if people are actually, if it's doing the intent that it's intended to do. We test a lot of things live in market too. We find that's more efficient for us. So those are the types of things that we're doing as we dig into work. We are not yet in the creative side of things being able to fully incorporate AI. We're dabbling at the edges, but I think we're very much interested in how AI can help power sort of the analytics and performance and metrics and things like that that we would ultimately need to deliver, because it's always going to be necessary for proving campaigns are working, getting continued investment to support them.
Yeah. So it sort of seems like this is a very new space, right? There's a lot of room to grow. In what ways do you think that the industry could better embrace the new tools at their disposal to enable better personalization at scale? And how might that change in the next couple of years as these tools develop?
Well, I think brands are already starting to try and take control back in-house. I think a lot of that insight sat separately in the creative agency, in the media agency, and in various different stakeholders. And as clients are sort of architecting to their own future and wanting to be masters and mistresses of their own destiny, we're seeing much more of those creative assets actually living alongside consumer data, segmentation, and they're connecting it to supply chain information, to their sales data. So there's sorts of decisions they can make. It's not that just because you can get a data set, you should ingest it and then make a decision on it. But I think that the variety of information that brands now have access to means that actually they're building bigger data or business intelligence divisions in-house. So it's about educating them, going on the journey with them, say creatively, how can you use different data sets to augment from and create value and make better decisions around whether it's your creative strategy or your media plans. Now, I think some clients are doing that really well and have been doing it for some time now. I won't name names, but in the CPG category, they're sort of doing it at scale. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. We're seeing better ads. We are seeing better ads. We are seeing better personalization actually happening. But that best practice isn't an industry standard yet. And I don't think necessarily there is an industry standard for engagement or attention, but there's lots of companies here on the Croisette that's talking about the new attention economy. I hope it's not something that we're just chasing after, but actually remains something actionable. So going back to my point about just because you can get the data set doesn't mean you need to ingest it, I think it's actually credibly looking at the ecosystem today and say what's relevant, because actually if you look at the MarTech, AdTech ecosystem, there's a ton of companies out there that do a little bit of everything. What I would consider toll tax on the highway. What brands need to be thinking about is the simplification of that ecosystem and understanding what they can extract from where. Our goal at Extreme Reach is to power that ecosystem. We want to make that data readily available for brands, creative agencies, and media agencies to use to do better measurement, to take better action for the future.
So I think your question was how can brands better use these tools and marketers better use these tools? So I'd be remiss if I didn't say obviously the answer is everyone needs to use Swayable. But I think more broadly, asking skeptical questions, which I think was sort of part of your point about what is this data proving, and making sure you've got the folks that are in fact doing that on your teams, whether that's on the agency side or it's an in-house group or you have an analytics team attached to the marketing group, and really kind of embracing this idea that we took as scientists. Valerie and me, co-founders, were experimental scientists before we started it, which is that if someone can't explain to you in understandable terms why this data proves the thing they say it is, it's probably them, not you, that's the problem. Richard Feynman was this great Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he could explain anything to you at any age with any given amount of time at a level that you would understand it. And I think you can kind of cut through the obfuscation of the kind of bullshit metrics if you just insist that what you're being told proves ROI or proves you're making the right decision actually has some conceptual basis that it does in fact prove that.
Stevie?
I mean, we've been living in an ocean of data for a very long time, and the thing that has not changed and will continue to be in need is when we get the data, when we have numbers, when we have information, we still have to figure out what is actionable and what to do with it. There's a meme that's floating around with the use of AI where it says, from a creative perspective, I'm safe because clients still have to ask something what to do. And so as long as we're sitting in the seat where we're having to explain to machines what it is we need, that's the place where we continue to have need all the time, because data by itself, information by itself, is not enough to point us in the right direction, to make insightful choices, to figure out the strategic plan, to do those things. So whether it sits in-house inside clients and brands, or whether it sits in an agency, the key is to always distill that information into the most actionable strategic method and holistic campaign plan that's going to work and have achieve the intent that it needs to do. And that's the part that I think we continue to need to develop a muscle in across the industry. And you mentioned some clients that are already doing best practices, but I think that's still a huge need, especially as a lot of clients are having to navigate the realities of going from third-party data to owning their own data as things are getting more and more restricted in other areas. So building those data sets, again, will be a huge need.
It's not more data, it's the right data.
Yes, what you said.
All right, well, that's the end of our panel. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.